Kathleen Norris grew up in Hawaii, Virginia, and Illinois. After graduating from Bennington College in Vermont, she moved to New York City, where, for the next 6 years, she wrote poetry and worked as an arts administrator. In 1973, she moved to Lemon, South Dakota. There, she continued to write and served for a time as a lay pastor of Rural Hope Church. Her first collection of poetry, Falling Off, was published in 1971, followed by The Middle of the World and Little Girls in Church. Her book of essays and prose poems, Dakota, A Spiritual Geography, was published in 1993. It found a wide and enthusiastic readership. In July 1995, Kathleen Norris spoke about her work on the grounds of the Benedictine Priory in Bismarck, North Dakota, a place to which she often returns.
My decision to move from New York City to Lemon, South Dakota was really some family business, that I was helping my mother sort of deal with her parents' death and what to do with the house and the farmland and all of these things that she had inherited. But for myself, my main, motivation was that I suspected that this would be a good place for me to write. I had a nice job in New York City in arts administration, but I also sensed that it was time for me to move on, to leave my first sort of post-college job and try to discover myself as a writer. I hadn't realized how much my move would be a haunting, of really encountering the family ghosts and the family stories that would take precedence in my writing. And I really guess I hadn't realized how much the place would affect me. I'd never lived here before. I'd come out here when I was a kid in summers, very close to my grandparents, but I'd never lived here, and that was a big difference, to really live in an agricultural area where people raise animals. And have a whole different culture from anything I had grown up with. That was important, and the big discovery, of course, was religion. After living here about 10 years, I think it was, in a sense, the spirit of the place itself, and being 2 doors down the street from my grandmother's church, all of that really contributed to my rediscovering religion. The title of the series, in fact, interests me very much, Listening for God, because in a way it was listening to this place that led me straight back to God. In other ways, I was just a typical baby boomer, reaching that in the 30s, having sort of dropped religion and dropped church after high school because that was my mom and dad's thing. And then realizing in my mid-30s, well, it really is my thing, and I've got to find a way to get back in touch with that. So that was happening, but I think it was listening to this place. This place, it's a place where being Christian is sort of the norm, which isn't true in a lot of places in America. And it's also the kind of place where even the most radical sorts of social change, feminist things like the domestic violence hotline and shelter, all of that has to come through the churches. That the church is the only institution that can affect that kind of change in this culture, which again sets it apart from a lot of academic environments, a lot of other environments. So there was listening to, I guess, the people around me and the spirit of the place kind of led me back to my traditional roots in Christianity. The Western Dakotas are, I think, demand that we look and demand that we see. And of course, I started that chapter with a joke. A friend of mine says, well, what is there to see? I mean, she's used to trees, urban environment, and to her, this was just a big nothing. And there isn't anything to see until you learn how to listen to the land and learn what to look for. The land here may look very empty, but it's actually really full of wildlife, of incredible variety of grasses, that sort of thing. But it's kind of subtle seeing and subtle listening. And I think that's a religious concept, that it's the religious and the holy are not the thing that's going to jump out at us. It's not like the one-liners in a sitcom, the quick, easy laugh. It's the long, deep laugh, I think, is more what I think of as God's sense of humor. Hope Church strikes me, and I think almost anybody who encounters it, as a holy place. Part of it is the visual, seeing the place. When you drive in, that's one of the reasons I described getting there, because you drive in the place and all of a sudden you're driving on these country roads gravel road, and the land kind of opens out before you, and you've got a view of a good 40 miles, and there's this little tiny building off there in the middle of nowhere. It's in the middle of a pasture. And you think, what guts do Christians have out here to just plunk a church down and call it good, you know? It's amazing. I think my image of it is a little ark in the sea of land. But the interesting thing about Hope Church to me is that, I say it in the book, that they sort of function like a tribe, but they're not tribal. They're not limited. Somehow they've managed to keep themselves very open to the world. And even though the services, I think, might strike, and the hymns that they have might strike a lot of people in the broader church and people with seminary training, it might strike them as pietistic. They're not pietistic in their spirituality, where it counts, where, you know, their sense of the world. They always read the mission report, and they always talk about world issues as well as, you know, the kind of me and Jesus stuff that drives intellectual Christians crazy. Being a poet and getting back in touch with church, that's provided some of the greatest, you know, comic and semi-tragic, I guess, moments for me, because and a lot of my recent writing since Dakota's focusing on this too. The whole issue of language, of course, is so important to poets, and what I sense is happening in a lot of churches, both Catholic and Protestant churches that I regularly attend, is that we've gotten very careless with the language we use in worship. And for a poet, it's excruciating. Sometimes it's excruciatingly funny. I mean, when I hear a Bible reading or a prayer where God is asked to look out for our family units, you know, I laugh out loud. It's conehead language. I collect bad prayers so I can read them out loud to people and make them see how funny they are afterwards. In the service, you just let it go. But that sort of thing interests me deeply, and I think it's as a poet that I'm listening. And often not finding the kind of language that I would find in poetry. That would the language of a lot of so-called secular writing and secular poetry is actually a lot more religious than often what I hear in church. I was led to the Benedictine monasteries through literature. I went to hear Carol Bly give a reading at this place called an abbey, and I'd never heard of an abbey. I didn't know what an abbey was, really, and knew nothing about monastic tradition, but I went to hear a writer give a reading. And I fell in love with the place, and I think the essence for me, and I've just kept coming back to these places for 12 years now, and very close to the Benedictines. And the first word of the rule of St. Benedict is listen. Listen, my child, you know, Benedict speaking to the prospective monk or sister. So listening, it's ironic, but I think for a poet to say this, but I think I learned how to listen to words from the Benedictines. I learned about the power of poetry from them because they are willing to recite the Psalms orally and sing them every single day, 3 or 4, 5 times a day. And to have poetry treated with that much respect just knocked me out. I mean, and it still does. To have the scriptures read and other meditations, readings read, and then have people willing to listen and sit there and absorb it for 2 minutes of silence after the reading. That's powerful, and it really does, it sort of reaffirmed what I knew as a poet, that language and words have the power to change us, have the power to change our lives. I admire writers. I think the culture our country right now needs writers being honest and listening to their inner voices and saying what has to be said through the medium of storytelling and poetry, not politicizing and not speeches, but letting stories go out there that maybe reflect reality that you're not going to get on the nightly news or the newspaper. In lots of my essays, and sometimes my poems, I'll reach a point where I'm writing along, I'm very happy, I think, okay, this is going great. And then the little thought will occur to me, well, next you have to write about that. And you go, oh, I can't write about that, that's too painful, that's too upsetting. And then, but you know, experience teaches you this, experience writing will teach you this, that is exactly where you have to go. And that the more personal and painful it is often, the more meaning it will have to other people. And I've also found this is very, very true of sermons. that I don't have to get up there and tell stories about myself, but I have to be willing to be present in that text at some personal level in order for it to reach other people. So they'll know that a real story is being told here, and they can kind of latch onto that. In any writing you do, you're aware of those things, and that things are going to come out that shock you, that you say, oh, I can't say that, or I don't want to say that, or and surprises come along where you in the writing itself you realize things you never really knew before. I mean, the writing teaches you a lot, and whether I'm writing a poem or a sermon or an essay, the writing shows me where I have to go. It's a very involved process of discovery.